Good evening. This is an unannounced live. It's a secret. It is the new moon at midnight, at least in my time zone. And this is the usual evening that I do something for Hecate, who is a goddess of other things, secrets and mysteries. Or if you've heard it another way, the phrase to will, to know, to do, and to be silent. Well, going on live isn't exactly silent, but you can't have a secret without something to have a secret about. So if you found me, if you were watching at the right time, welcome. What am I doing with this? This is a live like many of my others, where I will present some new material, longer poems that don't really fit on TikTok as easily, a song, and some story time, a new concept, a new improv idea that I'm trying out. So if you're interested, put me on in the background. I promise that what you hear will have been heard by no one else before. So welcome to all the guests that have come in. Yes, I didn't even tell my good friends. So again, if you're coming in now, it must have been meant to be. I see a lot of people coming in. That's great to see. I guess I'll start with the first one. And well, thank you. So the theme of the evening is also appropriate. Secrets, darker emotions. Thank you. I'm glad to see. I always am happy to see if my work is reaching other people. I hope I'm not your idol, though. Do better. Negative emotions, sorrow, grief, loss, and secrets themselves are in the themes. I don't know if that's actually a username, but hello to your friend. Happy birthday. Get to the point. I did mention the point. New work. Poetry, song, creations that you are getting to hear that no one else has. Well, other than the folks that have come into the room. I'll start with one appropriate enough, as it's midnight in my area. Mandyas Tou Nyx, for meaning the cloak of night. Some of it may sound familiar. The cloak of night can cover up a multitude of sins. Her midnight cloth is wove of things the doers rather hid. The night of cloaks can sin upon a multitude of covers, a gaggle of conspirators, a gathering of lovers. A multitude of cover-ups can cloak the night of sin. With stories straight, no one need know what you're indulging in. A multitude of nights can cloak the cover-up of sins. Submerged in darkness long enough, the light may yet forget. A sin of multitudes can cloak the covering of night. When no one's left knows otherwise, the wrong appears as right. Just playing with a phrase, of course dedicated to Nyx, goddess of night. Am I Mormon? Well, considering tonight's dedicated to Hecate, and I read a poem about Nyx, probably not Mormon. There are classicalists out there who write in mythology and in similar phrases, but yeah, not many of them actually are giving honor to those deities. So I mentioned that some of the work tonight is on the theme of grief, loss. So this next one is dedicated to someone very near and dear to my heart who has passed on. It's called Assembled in Memory. Tobacco and clove and sandalwood rose, silver and leather and smoke, absinthe and sours, dry preserved flowers, incense and tea tree oil showers. Industrial grinding, gel lights and writhing, lipstick and eyeshadow melting, spilled beer and blood, lube, spit and cum, thigh boots and elbow-length gloves. Antiques and tea shops, riverside boardwalks, Chinese and Indian takeout, cat milk and kittens, black mold and litter, potluck post-ritual dinners. Oxygen tanks, bandages changed, house trailers smoking remains, paint-wet apartment, earth in a garden, funk of a funeral parlor. That's To My Rose. Phrases that remind me of her and of the time we had together. Another epitaph, a poem in memory of something lost, but a little bit lighter in theme. This one's based on a true event. You'll probably guess which one. It's called On the Death of a GPS. By the way, hello again to anyone who's come in later and or who stuck around. I appreciate it. We had about 150 came in randomly. Stick around if you're interested. Like I say, I'm doing bardic work, poetry, songs, and some storytelling. New things, quiet things, secret things without announcement. It's been passed down through the family, my last name. This one's called On the Death of a GPS. I never use my old GPS. I have no need for it anymore. Why should it trouble me then when my account is deleted, removed after inactive years? I was born before GPS, before the internet, before anyone had one digital account, much less dozens, maybe more now than we can remember. It's not the data I'll miss, whatever it had gathered. I'll never need those routes again. I'll never return to that home. I might never drive those old roads again. The trips I took barely stay in my memory. Reviewing them might not even remind me. But when I drove those roads, when I made those trips, that GPS was with me, guiding me, keeping track, writing its quiet chronicle, saving a piece of those years, storing it safely and silently in case I wanted to remember. It served faithfully. It did its work well. And I never needed it after. Never after I bought my first smartphone. With its own GPS and maps online, and another, much better memory. I packed away that old GPS in a box in the basement, just in case I might need it again. But I never did. I forgot it. And now it has forgotten me. Its cloud has evaporated. Our story is lost. If I ever booted up again, assuming it still starts, it would not know me. It would not remember. We might start all over again, teaching it my information, training it on my preferences. And then it would work again, just as before, guiding and recording, building a new history. I won't do that, though. There's no point. It would be cruel to start a new relationship with a device I no longer need. But I look at my smartphone, so full of me, my history, writing loyally at my hip, and I wonder, how long until I don't need it? How long until I set it aside, in the basement, in a box? Or like its predecessors, surrender it to be recycled? And when will the accounts I use now, its memory of me, so faithfully maintained, stored away on high, be finally deleted? I tend to personify inanimate objects, but it is something to think about. Catch up on messages a little bit. Triple got us in the background. Thank you. We don't even remember where we picked that up at what point, but it's been hanging there in the altar room, the side study here. You were born a day before 9/11. Wow, we're pretty close together in birthdays. Mine's coming up, but farther apart in years. Yeah, 9/11, I woke up with my wife, Rose. I was in the middle of grad school. So, yeah, we looked at the TV and things were happening. Hey, is he a follower? Rick, thank you. I was hoping that a few people would carry over from the recent Major Arcana Allegory poem that I posted. At least a few people showed up and looked in. So, all right. For those coming in later, just to note what's going on, mention this is a secret live. It was unannounced, unexpected. I didn't tell anybody. Just reading poems that fit the theme tonight on the night of the new moon, close to midnight my local time. And these are items about grief, loss, and other negative emotions, and of course secrets themselves. Often I do the lives to do longer works that don't fit well on TikTok. Okay, this was the song. I haven't got a tune to it yet, so I'm going to read it in the best cadence I can. And like I said, I'm still working, and sometimes melodies don't come to me right away. But it's called The Spectators. We lived far before you, in times long since gone. We struggled, we built, and we died. We witnessed the horrors that history harbors, but we didn't stop them, just stood to the side. Not powerful people, not monarchs nor rich. Our words weren't as clever or loud. Though we weren't the monsters who sought to hurt others, the troubles they made were the crimes we allowed. We were the spectators. We were the crowd. We were the stiffs in the stands. We weren't the players that settled the scores, but we bought the tickets that paid for their games. Some were complicit, and some were disgusted, yet few stood to stand in their way. It wasn't our business what powerful folks did. We had our own needs and expenses to pay. A few preached religion or philosophized, but most didn't pay much attention. And some used those creeds as excuse for their deeds, twisting good words and noble intentions. We were the spectators. We were the crowd. We were the powerless mob. Although we were told we were needed to serve, we never believed that we were actually strong. What could we do when the worst came to pass? What could turn troubles aside? When those who resisted were made an example and lost their possessions, including their lives. Now look at your comforts, your homes and your habits. Look at the children you've raised. Which would you sacrifice just to save others? What do you overlook just to stay safe? You're just the spectators. You're just the crowd. You're just the commonplace folk. You're not the leaders who lie, cheat, and steal. You're just the workers who do what you're told. You're just the spectators. You're just the crowd. You're only trying to live. The troubles these days aren't really your fault. Your future descendants will surely forgive. It's a theme I've stood on before with a poem called Underfoot. It was praise to the ancestors who were crushed underfoot, who did stand in the way, who were not spectators. And this is a song about the other ones who watched as history unfolded. Is that you? Is that me? I'm at least trying to yell from the stands. Who knows how much good it's doing, but at least I'm calling boo! Or yay when something is done well. Welcome and thank you to those that have come in. Goodbye to those who've left. Again, this is a live themed around secrets and the dark of the night and the moon. This has kind of inspired the whole evening and theme. It's actually also inspired by some current media, Neil Gaiman's Sandman series. I have not watched through it all yet, but you may know one of the endless is Despair. And I think she gets a bad rap. It's often depicted as miserable and grotesque. Now, despair is not something anybody finds pretty, other than, I guess, a few Gothic folk, the beauty of despair. But I wanted to write something that was more understanding. It's called The Palace of Despair. The Palace of Despair is not a dark and dreary fort, sealed off from the world, concealed and cold. Its windows open wide and tall to grant the broadest view, revealing all the world's array of horrors. The miseries of every soul are shown in full detail, the pain and loss which every life must bear. Small victories and minor gains are easily offset by hate, mischance, disease, abuse, and death. Each peace pursued by rancor, and every love by anger, and each success by some dissatisfaction. Of those who've lived, some found no joy to even take away, and most who sacrificed were soon forgotten. People, through our history, forget who lived before them. Small and dull and ignorant they stay, of neglecting in their turn the needs of future generations, in endless, selfish cycles of pure folly. With portraiture and mirrors, great despair renews our memory, showing sorrow in its vast reflections, an infinite, identical, miserable regress through days, years, lifetimes, eras, eons. Despair maintains a library of cities tumbled down, of books we've burned, of names we've lost, of wisdom we've destroyed. It catalogs the dried up rivers, all extinguished species, all the hills eroded, and all the stars exploded. Despair is not short-sighted. It sees the end of all, of bloodlines, planets, stars, of all creation. Despair displays these wonders to all guests with eyes to see. It loves to share its gallery of destruction. To those who visit willingly, despair will show them everything, sparing none, concealing not one detail. Only those who look away or close their eyes or minds are blinded in the palace of despair. Sorry to anyone who was depressed when I started that. Looks like they left. I deal with depression on a pretty regular basis, and one of the dangers is looking too far and too deep. It's not a matter of perspective. It's sometimes lying to yourself about the true scope and how bad things could be. And sometimes remembering that lets you know how bad they aren't. So it's a mood thing. All right, well, if there's anybody still on, it's not showing me any current viewers or followers, but hey, I'll continue on. I'm doing this as much for myself and for Goddess Akate as anybody else. They're getting a little bit longer as I go. The next poem is called Rare Word Collector. That's me. And it might be some of you. But I have a very specific association with lost and forgotten words. The words that people are not using as often, that they're not speaking nearly as often. Archaisms, forgotten terms. So that's what this was about. Again, another form of loss and memory. Rare Word Collector. This is true, by the way, every word of it. Once I studied rarer words, the ones that get least use. Across 1,000,000 words of speech, you'll maybe hear them once. Not only rare, but rarely known, with meanings few remember, or at the worst they can't recall when those words were encountered. I looked to see what traits they shared, that led to their decline? Were they weird or long or old? What made them fade from mind? I found 3 trends among the group which formed an explanation. Some were jargon, some were foreign, some were archaisms. Jargon words are no surprise. They're technical and special, mainly used in certain fields and not in daily prattle. Foreign words are loan words, only partway into English, known to some who've been exposed but not yet well distinguished. Elder words, though, once weren't rare. They'd had their day as common, but need and time had passed them by and left them near forgotten. They linger on in books and poems and lines in plays and operas, but rarely find a modern use, replaced by newer options. When castles fell, we lost the call to speak of crenellations, and newer arms and armor have replaced épée and cuirass. Yes, some who play at certain games will find these terms familiar, but you'll admit that only proves that they're otherwise less popular. And even sailors rarely say abaft, amain, or larboard. When terms are old and jargon, their use is even rarer. But what about those words of old that served a noble duty, that held a place in memory for fine detail and beauty? I speak of words of verse and art, like gauche and chiaroscuro, terms that still are known to some, but aren't used too often. These are words I dearly love for serving with distinction, and I adore them all the more for fading from our diction. I decided from that time that I would be their champion, if not to make them popular, to save them from extinction. I'd use them in my daily works and written conversation, dooming me to prose and verse that cause incomprehension. My special word, my favorite word, is this one, coruscation, which means like light upon the waves, illuminate vibration. So pardon me if I'm unclear or speak with awkward rambling. I fell in love with ancient words while studying our language. Like I say, completely true. I use coruscation wherever I can. If you've listened to many of my poems here on TikTok, it showed up in at least one that I can think of, possibly more. People have come and gone, as it goes. Finishing up here with the last poem. It's running about like my lives usually do, about half hour of poetry, half hour of storytelling. Sneak advance, for those who are listening. The story tonight is improvisational. It's a sneak preview, another little secret, of work that I'm probably going to be moving to another platform, possibly YouTube Live, possibly Twitch, if that pans out. These are referred to as the Tales of Sir Darius Quincy, or the Untold Tales. There's a character that I came up with a while ago, a gentleman explorer who has many stories of his centuries of adventuring. And it's just free-form storytelling, interacting with the audience, seeing how it goes. It's the idea of a older, gallant adventurer well past his prime, reminiscing on the past. If this sounds a little bit like another character of yore, Baron von Munchausen, that is the idea. Something modern in that vein. Okay. One more poem, though, before I get to that story. Again, one more a little bit about sorrow, but less negative. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. I've got a lot of ideas and jotting down what I can. All right. This one I'm going to finish up with the poems. It's called Mental Candy. When I was young, I held no special love for simple sweets. I much preferred my vegetables or cheese or bread or meat. I couldn't comprehend why other kids so loved their sugar, when there were better tastes in life, like savory or bitter. But now as I've grown older and my peers gain wider tastes, I've recognized that I want candy in some other ways. In clothes, in games, in media, in many entertainments. I like the light and humorous, with energy in excess. Sweet and simple best describes the stories I consume, the candy-colored silliness in new and old cartoons, and even in my output work, the tasks I'm now pursuing. I most enjoy composing something simple and unnuanced. The poetry that flows so free is easier than novels. It quickly comes as quickly done and quickly is rewarded. It might seem strange when these works range through hate and love and death to call my verses simple or compare them to desserts. But there are courses waiting that I need to go and finish, the meat and bread that feeds my life, those leaves of mental spinach. I know where my nutrition lies, and I'm still working healthy, but other meals don't satisfy as much as mental candy. I might suspect that since I used to span a wider palette, reading classic tragedies and writing complex fiction, I overdid the heaviness, got gagged on grit and gristle. So now I want some lighter fare that takes far less digestion. As a bastard who might pride himself on bloody butchery, to stew and roast the worst of life in hopes of raising standards, I find myself embarrassed when I opt for sweet and sparkles, fuzz and fluff and childish love, pure happiness and laughter. Even when I've filled my poems with centers sharp and savory, I wrap them in a tasty crust of sugared buttered pastry. But then it's been much easier to get such treats accepted by masses who won't stick around for 5-course fiction banquets. If I balance my own diet, keeping strong perspective, it shouldn't matter what I love myself when given preference. There's nothing wrong with sugar or an evening of indulgence, as long as I avoid decay or excess empty calories. They say that as we reach old age, we act again as children. And if that's caused by change in taste, there's worse traits for reversion. But as I said, I wasn't much for sweets when I was younger. Maybe I've just finally learned to like a bit of sugar. And I'll tell you, I caught myself, like say, watching a little too many cartoons and anime and going, wait, no, there are stories here. There are emotions here. Thank you. And there are often serious topics hidden within that brightly colored, sweet exterior. One of the biggest examples I've heard from friends watched, I have not finished the series, but I know the general gist. Steven Universe is like, oh, it's a fun kids cartoon. Death, loss, pain. Ah! So they hide some things in the center of that candy shell. All right. I see a few folks have come in, and I appreciate the commentary. Thank you. If you didn't know, and I said sort of at the beginning and the middle, this is a secret live, unannounced, with a lot of material that I've not told anybody about or read for them before. So you are the first to hear these things. It's also the dark of night, a bit after midnight, my local time, on the new moon. So this was a quiet secret. Those who have showed up were meant to be here. All right, so I've read through the poetry and the song I had for tonight. The last thing, I wanted to tell you a story. Or rather, it's not me telling the story. It is the voice of a character, Sir Darius Quincy, gentleman explorer, knight of the realm of 1,000 teeth. He is a storyteller, perhaps a braggart, perhaps a tall tale teller. You have to decide how much you believe. The first told tale of Sir Darius Quincy is called The Mystery Bottle, and it's spoken from his perspective, of course. Good evening, friends, and welcome to the manor. I'm so pleased you found your way here. Have a seat. There's a place by the fire. As you warm up, allow me to entertain you. Something small, something light, from my history, my travels as a knight errant. This story comes from the midpoint of my career, when I had established a name and reputation, but was not yet a landed knight. I did not have my home yet. It is the tale of the mystery bottle. One of those days, I was traveling in what one might call a Badlands area, a barren, difficult, dangerous land, in between realms, unsettled and untamed. I was passing through on my way to deliver a message of diplomatic importance. The exact details of the message are no longer a secret, but I will leave that for another story for another time. I was traveling with two companions at the time. The half-dead Zendrel. Now you ask, what is a half-dead? Exactly what it means. He was partially alive and partially undead. I think the undead was on his mother's side, but don't ask me about the specific details. Zendrel never told me, and I never thought it right to ask. You can only imagine. Suffice it to say, he was a gaunt, pale sort of being, prone to fits of mania and depression and turns, as one side or the other took over. Overcompensation, one might say. But he was quite the doughty and skilled swordsman, and a bit of a mage to boot, specialized in spells of sleep, quiet, calm. Useful skill for diplomats as we were supposed to be. But enough about him. I was also traveling with my other friend and compatriot, Ukiyo. She was a kappa, a water spirit from the Far East. We met shortly after the events of the oil-soaked blade. Another story for another time. But I met her just outside the Lakes of Sorrow, and one thing and another, we decided to travel together. It was a matter of restoring her honor, and I was deemed a fit enough companion to aid that cause. So, on our travels, quite a few battles, quite a few deprivations, we were thrilled to come across a small settlement, a village of sorts, clapboard homes, stone constructions torn from the unforgiving land. And within that village, there was a tavern called The Last Shot. If you pass that way, you may see it. And if you listen to this story, you'll have some warning about what to expect. The Last Shot was fairly unremarkable. I mean, a clientele from all over, whoever was traveling through the Badlands. So all sorts of beings, entities, mostly other adventurers like ourselves, but quite a few outlaws hiding from more civilized lands. And its great claim to fame, and the source of its name, was the mystery bottle. This was a tradition that had started years before, in which a enchanted, unlabeled bottle was placed behind the bar with a sign reading 1 gold, 1 shot, you keep the rest. What this meant when we came into the tavern, saw the sign, and asked about it, was that there was a bargain. Anyone who was brave or foolhardy enough to sample the mystery bottle, to purchase it for 1 gold coin, also had to take a single shot from the bottle. The enchantment was such that they would know exactly what it was they had bought, but by then it would be too late. As we learned later, hearing more stories from the clientele, sometimes the bottle contained deadliest poison, and the drinker dropped dead on the spot. Not such a bargain, depending on how you view things. Sometimes it was a potion of one type or another. Something to heal a wounded body, something to grow one a prehensile tail, or whiskers, a variety of things. I assume that there was some amused mage coming up with these, or perhaps they were the accidents of alchemical work. Sometimes, though, the bottle would contain a liquor a drink of great value. One of the ones that I heard about was called Dryad's Brandy. It was literally a brandy which was grown by a dryad from a vine that grew on her heart tree, the tree that she lived within. And so this dryad knew this vine intimately, knew its absolute every cycle, and could pick the grapes at the point of their greatest ripeness. So it was, in all senses, the perfect brandy. Quite a bargain for one gold coin. And sometimes you might get, of course, rot-gut moonshine, or simply a fine wine, possibly equal to the value spent. And sometimes the bottle was simply water or urine or something equally amusing. But, of course, the bargain itself was only part of the deal. It was the bravery of the act, the machismo, as some would say. So, as we came into the tavern, we sat down, had our bowls of unidentifiable stew, some kind of ale. My constitution is quite robust, so I had no fear for standard food, even if it was a little off. Vendrell, of course, being half dead, could subsist on the meanest of fare. He did us the courtesy of not eating carrion. And Ukiyo was a bit of an ascetic. Drank only water, ate only simple things like bread. So she made do with what was available. But the three of us began to talk. This bottle, as it was meant to be, was a great conversation starter. And we speculated, and we overheard others speaking, and it kept us interested through the night. As I mentioned, Vendrell was prone to fits, changes of mood, and I caught him looking curiously at the bottle. He asked, "Would you consider it, Darius? I mean, who knows what you might find? It might be a great treasure." I said, No, I'm not that brave. After all, it could be anything. It could be a joke. It could be poison. I get this crowd would be just as amused to see someone fall over dead as be rewarded. He scratched his head, said, if it is poison, it's not really going to hurt me. There's few things that I'm really vulnerable to. And if it's a potion, well, it could be entertaining. I'm sure you can fix up whatever goes wrong. I looked at him, said, don't sell me too high. I know some people, but some magic is hard to deal with. And Yukio only snorted. I should note that Yukio was a cautious sort anyway, wore a tight helm to keep the water in her head. None of that foolishness about bowing and spilling it out. But I knew that she wasn't interested in this bargain. Now, we finished up and began to think whether this place was safe for a night's rest when Vendrell stood up. And I could see his eyes were still locked on that bottle. I started to wonder if we would need to perform a rescue or be down one member. But someone beat him to it. An interesting fellow, I assume Woodwose, judging from the sprouts of herbs jutting out from behind his ears and in his hair and the rough bark of his neck, trundled up to the bar, laid down his coin, and said, "Keeper, I'll take the bottle." Well, again, as we later learned, there was more than one bottle, so once one was taken down, after a while, the tavern owner would put one back, but we assumed that was it. It had been bought. The bartender nodded, pulled down the mystery bottle, pulled out a shot glass, took the coin from the bar, and poured the shot. I couldn't see it very well, but to my eye in the distance, the liquid glowed a faint greenish tinge. Not often an encouraging sign. But perhaps it looked appetizing to the Woodwose. He turned back, and I could see he was gesturing to a crowd of compatriots, probably a sign of bravery. He lifted and downed the shot. The enchantment kicked in, and he, though no one else did, knew exactly what it was he had drunk. He began to reach across the bar, apparently to attack the barkeeper, but didn't have the time. There was a tingle of something being released, and the man burst into a cloud of fine brownish red mist, which scattered in every direction across the tavern, pattering down on the tables and the patrons and our meals and our beers. The crowd roared with applause and laughter. Even the Woodwos' compatriots, who had just watched him burst apart, were clapping and stomping as if they had witnessed, well, perhaps a gladiatorial execution, but certainly not something glorious or wonderful. Vendrell sat back down. Ukiyo shook her head and began to wipe whatever had become of the man from her scales. I took a napkin and tried to do likewise. But we agreed there would be no more experiments, and perhaps it was time to go and seek water to wash off. That is the tale. It is exactly as it happened. I'm sorry if it wasn't more edifying, educational, but sometimes what actually happens contains a lesson. Well, I hope that the fire has warmed you. I hope my tale has lit up your mind a bit, but I think it is time to retire, and after that, I might like a bath myself. Good night, friends. Welcome to my manor. Your rooms await you. And that is the first told tale of Sir Darius Quincy, The Mystery Bottle. Again, have a lot of a tradition of the audience staying very silent. I mean, obviously live chats undermine some of that. I like what I see occasionally on Twitch, where it's an interactive process between entertainer and audience chat. So that's what I'm trying to develop, is bringing back that idea of the storyteller being present in the group, in the crowd, taking questions, interrupting the story, going off on sidetracks, which I'm very good at, but then also keeping a cohesive story, and to some extent a cohesive storyline. Sir Darius is a character I've dealt with and used in many a tale, and he's full of stories. So, unless there's any questions or requests. Oh, am I going to read one of my books tonight? I wasn't planning on it, but there is time. I can go until about 1 my time, another 15 minutes. So if you'd like, what I have within reach. So there are the science fiction books called the Empyrean Dream Story. One's about pirate ships, basically space piracy. That's the Tales of the Scapegrace. There's one book about a dinosaur detective, Saurian. Again, this is science fiction. That's the Stitchvik Chronicles or Stitchvik Investigations. I'm going to be a writer. Excellent. I hope that very soon you will be a writer. I know some people say that meaning that they will be published, and I certainly hope that for you too. But you're a writer as soon as you write. As soon as you start putting down your stories, you are a writer. The goal is to be a better one. The goal is to be a paid one if you're aiming at that. But that's one of the things that I taught myself early on is I had been a writer all my life. I just didn't take ownership of that phrase, of that name. And right now my work is self-published. I just went, I'm tired of waiting. This is not things that publishers are asking for. I'm going to print my own. And I take them out to conventions and bookstores locally and make a little bit of money, but mostly it's about getting things into people's hands and eyes and ears. So Do you have any preferences? Sorry, my vocals are a little off. Rick, about what kind of story? The other one, of course, is the Guardian Fighters era that I've read from on my previous couple of lives. That's martial arts fantasy, a light novel that I worked on for a client. I have a number of short stories too. Oh, I know what I would like to read. I don't know if it's of your interest, but I have some short stories that were published in journals that are very different types. Some sci-fi, some fantasy, some things. If that sounds good, I'll go dig that up and see if I see your response. Okay. Awesome. Sounds good. Okay, there's a story, Transit, which is a historic travel tale. Oh, well, these are all the same volume. I guess I'm going to read that one. So Transit, there's also a story called The Morrison Hotel, which is about a sentient hotel. And one I love, and I'll find this for a future live. I'll try to remember this one. There's a story called, I believe it's just called Honey, about an otherworldly hound dog who gets adopted. I love that one, by the way. It's in a journal called Wild Violet, going back a couple years ago it was published. But yeah, let's read this one, Transit. I haven't shared it, certainly online. It was just in print, but I have full rights, so no problem. Oh, it's in the journal, by the way. It's called The First Line. Their gimmick is they give you a first line of a story and then invite everyone to write whatever is inspired, whatever genre, whatever type of story is inspired by that line. So it's sort of a journalistic or writing exercise. It's a good one, by the way. How does one go about protecting their work? It's a good question. Technically, you have copyright as soon as you publish or present your work. You have to claim it. And here's the key thing. If you want help defending that copyright, if you want a record that can be referenced legally, you have to send notice of publication to the not the Library of Congress. I do that too for my books, but to the Copyright Office. Search online U.S. copyright filing or recording, and there's a fee because what they're doing is creating a record of that work as it was published with your name as ownership of the copyright. And I'm not sure of the time frame, how long those will last and stay on record, but it's a fairly long time. Otherwise, though, in a practical sense, don't share a full manuscript or full work with anyone but a publisher, or if you're willing to let it be public with an audience, keep things quiet. That fits the theme of tonight. Keep things secret until you're ready to release it wherever you choose. If you trust someone for pre-reading or for review commentary, that's okay. But one of the mistakes that I had made early on was putting work in progress on a blog. Anybody could have grabbed that at any point, plagiarized the hell out of it if they thought it was that good. I didn't think it was, and claimed it for their own. It had no real protection, legally speaking. So I needed to keep it quiet if I wanted to do that. I didn't mind. It was my training wheels, my practice. So I didn't think about it at the time. But now all my books that I self-publish have a statement in the front saying copyright year Nathan Large, and they have a registration number with the Copyright Office, filed and marked as my ownership, my copyright. So that's my practice, and my best advice is keep things quiet. Of course, if you publish with a formal publisher, they're going to have some kind of ownership rights depending on what contract you sign. So they're not likely to copy or steal your work, but they can reproduce it at that point once you sign over the rights. There's more to that and more specific knowledge. I haven't gotten to that point in my career, so to speak, but I would love to. And as I learn more, I can pass on more. But yeah, I definitely recommend checking into formal copyright filing if there's anything that you're wanting to make sure is protected and not stolen. Another really good practice, and this has gone back to the days of paper manuscripts, is to mail the whole manuscript to yourself. You can use email now, and that helps, because it will create a trail. It'll have a date on it as to when you created and finished that work. Then if you see it in print somewhere else later, someone else has stolen it, again, you have to be willing to take the legal recourse to get a lawyer, to give them a cease and desist, to file a lawsuit if necessary. But then you have proof. And it used to be when people would send out paper manuscripts, they'd mail one to the publisher and one back to themselves. That way they've got a sealed, dated, marked envelope that says, I created this work on such and such a date. So anything that comes afterward can't be the original. So that's another idea. Again, it's about creating a trail and creating some protection. Nothing, unfortunately, will stop a true plagiarist, and unfortunately, there are unscrupulous sorts that will just scrape blog posts and online journals, back in the day, MySpace, or now Tumblr, things like that. They'll just grab whatever and post it as their own work. For that, you just got to be vigilant. Most of my motivation is, of course, sharing things with people. So, hey, if other people read what I've written, as long as it doesn't get changed and bastardized into something different than it was intended, as long as it's the same words, I'm not as upset, especially if it's my poetry. Please don't steal my poetry. I'm not saying to do that. But hey, if more people hear it and more people feel those things or come to appreciation of the gods and other beings who are being applauded and lauded, that's awesome. I can deal with that. For my stories, anything that's not improv or that's in published books, don't steal it. I will have a legal case. And some things I might actually be willing to pay to protect. Hopefully that was not too long of an answer to the question. I'll get on to the story now. Okay, so I was saying this is a story called Transit. It's in the journal, The First Line, back in... When did they publish this? Oh, this one's from 2016. This is early in my career. I started seriously writing where I would call myself a writer in about 2014. You're welcome. Like I say, I hope that's a good set of pointers to start out. And I got paid for this, which was really exciting. It was just a one-time check, and they just got the rights for publication. Rights reverted to the author once the journal came out. The first line that they gave everybody to start these stories out was, in the 6 years I spent tracking David Adderley, it never occurred to me that he didn't exist. Why would it, when every lead I followed confirmed his presence? Many people had identified him in Alexandria. His name was in the log of the packet boat Tigris when I pursued it from Suez to Bombay. Witnesses recognized him in India, not by name but by appearance. His fellow guests at the Watson's Hotel recalled the man, well-dressed, balding, pale and gaunt, with sunken cheeks and half-rotten teeth. A waiter had heard Adderley mention the new rail line running east. I followed him there as far as Allahabad before losing the trail. I'm far ahead of myself already. Your question was why I had invested so much time and money, so much of my life, in the pursuit of that shriveled specter. What return could I possibly reap from such a monumental expense? To answer these very rational questions, I must return to my journey's irrational beginning. I was vacationing in Valencia in the spring of 1869, the early days of the region's artistic rebirth. My introductions within the city's social circles brought me more than culture. They earned me the attention of Leonora René Elevante Suarez, the daughter of the poet Miguel Blasco Suarez. Back then I was hale, young, and well-heeled. practically a walking advertisement for Mother Britain. I thought myself perhaps too good a catch for Leonora. I was torn between her wit and her beauty versus my potential to find a mate of higher status. My family had expectations. If I pursued Leonora, I would be called to account and asked to explain her value to the family. What did Leonora have to offer? No title, little dowry, but she possessed a keen and learned mind. She had a perfect face, the sort of alabaster glory that made Spanish princesses worth trading for political alliances. Those royal days were ending, the revolution having driven Doña Isabella out of her country. No one could answer with certainty whether a new monarchy would be installed. In the meantime, the chaos provided opportunities for we foreign visitors. I was one such. All I wanted was refuge and romance. David Adderley was another invasive transplant. What did he want? I never met the man myself. I knew him only indirectly, through Senor Miguel Suarez. Adderley attended the parties that I did not. I had thought Leonora paid him no heed. The scholar was, as I have mentioned, unpleasant in appearance. According to Senor Suarez, Adderley was also disturbing in manner. If not for his obvious wealth and rumored connections, Senor Suarez might never have humored the wretch. The poet needed a promoter and publisher. He had dreams of being read outside of his native country. The praise of his contemporaries, not to mention the appreciation of we foreign youths, inflated those dreams. We flitted from salon to salon, tasting lyrics along with wines, sampling art and hors d'oeuvres. To Senor Suarez and a dozen like him, we were potential heralds of fame up north, envoys who might carry his name back when the summer drove us home. If all went well for Senor Suarez and me, I might well have transported his career home along with his daughter. A decent Spanish poet wasn't a bad start for an aspiring patron of the arts. I never learned what David Adderley originally wanted in Valencia, but he, too, tried to claim Leonora. He succeeded, and he failed. I called upon the Villa Suarez at midday upon the 30th of March, just after the Holy Week celebrations. The door did not open immediately upon my knock. When I persisted, a scullion answered, miserable and furious. She informed me that the señorita was unwell, the master was unavailable, and I should come back another time. Her manner was far more honest than her words. I bowled past the servant and crossed the patio, seeking Leonora's room. It was a quite improper act, but my concern for my beloved overrode my good manners. I climbed the inner stairwell, the woman still cursing and begging me to leave. We came to Leonora's bedroom, where I found Senor Suarez and an unfamiliar doctor. I saw no sign of Leonora until I focused upon her bed, between the two men. The blankets were drawn up and an oblong form concealed beneath them. "What are you doing here?" demanded Senor Suarez. "I said no one should be admitted." The scullion jabbered apologies, spiced with insults to my character. I paid her no heed, interrupting her tirade to answer his question. "I heard Señorita Suarez was unwell. I had to know what troubled her and offer any aid you might require." The doctor fixed me with a cruel stare and even more cruelly said, "The trouble suffered by Señorita Suarez admits no aid. She is dead." At this, her father released a cry of grief. I realized that he had been holding on until then, waiting for the doctor to complete his examination. I felt awful. Still, I could do no worse after. I pressed on, assuming the role of investigator. "Dead! By what cause?" The doctor looked at Senor Suarez, who was fighting back sobs. "None I can identify. As a matter of fact, I am not sure I should give my findings with you gentlemen present. I suspect foul play." Senor Suarez's misery was suspended by shock. He turned on the gray-bearded reaper and demanded, "Foul play? Tell me what you mean immediately. I have a right to know." The doctor shook his head. "I am not sure of anything. There is no mark upon her, no injury or symptom, but she does not breathe. She grows cold. Something swept the life from her, but I cannot tell what. Now, gentlemen, I must ask that you leave until an official investigation clears you of suspicion." Senor Suarez looked likely to throw himself across the bed, but composed himself manfully and stood. Giving the doctor a hard look, he spat, "I see. If you have erred in any way, God help you, for I will have a reckoning." With this, he turned to leave. I backed out of the room to give him way, doing my best to nod an apology to the bleak-faced doctor. I, too, was shocked and angry. Mostly, though, I was stunned by confusion. Leonora? Dead? Someone and not some sickness to blame? But who? And more baffling, why? Everyone in her house loved her. None in the neighborhood had a grudge against her. Who could have wanted to do her harm? Senor Suarez answered my questions without need to ask. When we were outside on the landing and the door closed behind us, he stared into the sky and muttered the name. Adley. David Adley? I asked, surprised to hear the odd man's name. What do you mean? How could he be involved? Leonora was under his tutelage, explained Senor Suarez, still looking away from me. I realized that he was as much embarrassed as devastated. I had no idea Leonora was seeing the decrepit Adley, much less on any regular basis. I know the man hovered around her, but I had assumed it was in the manner of a supplicant. Not that her father had allowed Adley private audience. A tutor? In what? I thought you were her teacher, I prompted. Languages, history, natural philosophy, the things of the world about which I have less experience, Senor Suarez elaborated. Dr. Adley came recommended by peers in Cambridge and Prague. Better, Leonora liked him, and he charged little. What a fool I was. No doubt he wanted only to get close to her. But I thought there was little risk, not with some wizened scholar like that. Finally he faced me. I was a fool too to indulge her interest, but I thought she should learn everything she might. Her death is partially my fault, but I am sure the greater part of the blame lies with Adley. He was with her yesterday evening, after supper. Unchaperoned? I asked. His eyes flashed. Yes, unchaperoned. I said I erred, didn't I? As I said, the man was a wretch. If he tried anything untoward, I thought Leonora could throw him out herself. Surely she would not be interested in him to allow him any liberties. Of course not, I allowed. I apologize. But you think this man did harm her? Senor Suarez shook his head. I can only deduce. He departed quickly last night, saying Leonora had retired to her rest. I took him at his word. I even bid him good night. He must have been fleeing his crime. Now that I think on it, he seemed strange, unbalanced, uncomfortable. I do not know what quarrel passed between them, but he must have caught her by surprise. There was no outcry. We all would have heard. It sounds like a certain case, I agreed. But I thought the doctor said there was no mark on her. Oh, for the question, I'm reading an old story of mine published in a journal. It's called Transit. It is a historic tale. Let's see. I thought the doctor said there was no mark on her. None he could detect, answered Senor Suarez, his expression darkening. But Adley had chemical knowledge. Ether or chloroform could have subdued her, or perhaps he struck her somewhere undetectable. The investigators will find out. Oh, there will have to be an autopsy. My poor Leonora. His suppressed grief threatened to envelop him again. We fell silent while he regained his composure, and in the quiet my resolve welled and hardened. The police would be coming. They would perform the necessary desecrations upon Leonora's corpse. My Leonora, my eternal partner. Her untimely death only cemented the certainty of my eventual vows. Looking back now across my many follies, I see their origin in that moment. I was one suitor out of many. Leonora was foremost among my interests, but certainly not exclusive. I had not firmly decided upon her hand, not until it was cold and still. I turned to the wavering Suarez and held out my hand, its own tremors stilled by my stiffening will. Sir, I swore, I will pursue this David Adley and make certain he does not escape Valencia, or if he does, I will track him down and bring him to justice. He looked at me uncertainly. The police will handle that. There is no need for you to endanger yourself. They will delay, I answered with a youth's distrust of authority, until his guilt is certain in their minds, and then they will pursue. By then he might be on a ship for South America. No, I will not allow that to happen. In all honesty, I needed the chase. I needed to get away from that grieving house and Senor Suarez's shame. I also wanted to avoid the searching questions of the police, which would bear only my unimportance. My self-assigned mission gave me the excuse to flee, as well as granting a sense of power. I gave myself the title of hero. When I caught Adelie, I could vent my frustrations over losing the suddenly indispensable Leonora. Senor Suarez took my hand. "See," he said, "catch him. Bring him here." We parted then with that understanding. I would capture David Adelie and return him to Villa Suarez to face justice. Of course, if the police caught him first, my charge was done. But what if he evaded us all? My oath did not consider that clause. I had not specified the length of my pursuit, only its endpoint. At most, I had expected to traverse the city, or perhaps I might cross the Mediterranean, or endure a train ride across Spain to intercept the fugitive. But Adelie was far ahead of us all. By the time I spoke with Senor Suarez, David Adelie was already aboard a merchanter bound for Alexandria. It took me several hours to confirm his route and the rest of the day to prepare. I took passage myself, arranging to have my apartments packed and transported. I sent notices to the authorities in both Valencia and Alexandria. I was not pleased to be abandoning the temperate modern pleasures of Valencia for the arid chaos of Alexandria. Why was Adelie fleeing to Egypt anyway? The region was astir with anti-imperial sentiment, the Canal and Suez flaring nationalistic passions. Perhaps that was Adelie's goal, to escape European law by finding refuge among Eastern partisans. For all I knew, he might have friends in the area. At the time, I knew nothing of David Adelie's true nature or the nature of his scholarly pursuits. I had no sense of the entity I pursued, or the reasons behind his flight. Looking back now, years later and wiser, I can see what I was chasing. I understand more, if not all, about the logic of events. But back then, crossing the sea, I knew nothing. In Valencia, the authorities also remained ignorant. They found no proof of murder. They filed no criminal charges and made no effort to seek David Adelie, not even as a witness. Senor Suarez buried Leonora before I left Alexandria, with most of Valencia society present to memorialize her short life. When his letter finally caught me in Allahabad, I was unsurprised by his continued bewilderment. He wrote that it was as if the soul had simply fled the body. When I finally uncovered Adelie's secrets, Suarez's words seemed like a prophecy. By the whims of Poseidon, I arrived in Alexandria 2 days behind David Adelie. I went immediately to the consulate office and requested help. The ambassador was courteous, but ultimately powerless to assist. The local Zaptiye, or the Ottoman gendarmerie, were unwilling to assist in the apprehension of a British national unofficially accused of crimes committed in Spain. The year of the story is 1869. If they captured Adelie for misdeeds in Egypt, they might consider extradition, following any local punishment. The best I could obtain was some intelligence about the man and his movements. As I feared, he did have allies in the city. Fortunately, none of these were authorities, merely financially influential traders. One of them, Uthman Abdul Rashid, was most likely to house Adelie given their history together, a shared interest in antiquities. To wit, Adelie could identify artifacts, and Abdul Rashid could obtain and resell them. This information was all I obtained during my first week in Alexandria. It was also all the aid I could expect. Officially, my compatriots could do little to trace or detain Adelie. I had their sympathies, and they promised to relay any news. In the meantime, I found lodgings, refreshed my wallet by trading in a letter of credit, and enjoyed myself as best I could. 6 days later, I resumed my search by paying a visit to the house of Uthman Abdul Rashid. The trader himself was unavailable. I was received by a major domo who heard my concerns. He reassured me that while Dr. Adelie was indeed an associate of Sahib Abdul Rashid, the professor had not visited nor contacted his master's house. I outlined my accusations and asked that he contact me through the consulate if Adderley did show. At the time of the interview, I had no sense I was being put off, much less deceived. But clearly I touched a spark into powder. Before I reached my hotel, I was set upon by 3 thugs with knives. They ambushed me in a side street, striking without speaking. I sustained serious wounds before managing to escape into a crowd. Adderley. Or Abdul Rashid. Either way, my quarry knew I was in pursuit. I knew I was on the right path. Why else attempt an attack on my life? I dismissed any thought of random robbery. The men were too silent and coordinated to be mere thieves. The hotel summoned a doctor to tend my injuries, and the ambassador to discuss the incident. The latter agreed that the circumstances were suspicious, but halted at accusing Abdul Rashid. We managed to persuade the Zaptiya to investigate, courteously. Their inquiries around the trader's home confirmed Adderley's presence there. Further investigation, supplemented with a few bribes, revealed that Adderley was already outside of Alexandria. He had joined a merchant's camel caravan to Suez. As soon as my healing wounds permitted, I hired my own escort and crossed the Egyptian isthmus. Having come so far and weathered such hazards, I had no choice but to continue. I also was driven by my oath to Senor Suarez, not to mention my lingering grief over Leonora's loss. Many times in my journey, particularly in Alexandria, I puzzled over the circumstances of her death. What had driven Adderley to take her life? What method did he use that left no mark? Why did he flee? He could have cried out and pretended her disability was no fault of his own. I had overlooked several clues in Alexandria. The first was the nature of the relationship between Adderley and Abdul Rashid. Actually, the prelude to that clue was in Senor Suarez's account of Adderley's tutelage. A classicist, a natural philosopher, a chemist. I had learned that Adderley was also something of an expert on ancient cultures. I should have asked what sort of cultures. The answer might have spared me years of confusion. Then there was the route of Adderley's flight. Not subtle nor comfortable. No time wasted. Not even a night spent in comfort as the trader's guest. No, Adderley ran straight to Abdul Rashid's door, traded upon their history for a favor, then was gone. Adderley had no way to know I was following him before my own rashness provoked the counterattack. Why then run as if the devil were on his tail? Now I know he was not running from. He was running to. The warning of my pursuit only spurred him to more speed. As I mentioned, once he reached Suez, he booked passage for Bombay. I guessed at his intentions and stayed on his trail with little difficulty. The gendarmerie was also much more helpful in Suez, having been advised by their fellows in Alexandria. There was nothing for it but to take the next ship out. In this exchange, I had the better outcome. Adderley's transport was a crowded packeter, whereas I found relatively spacious quarters above a merchant bark. We maintained our relative distance across the Red and Arabian Seas. I'm reading left to right, but it's reversed on the camera. Sometimes I have to reverse if I'm actually showing something. The journal called The First Line. No problem. I occasionally get pauses, but yeah, unfortunately reading like this doesn't give me as many opportunities to answer right away. And it's from a journal that I was published in back in 2016, one of my first paid stories. Just reading to share since one of the viewers had asked for a reading. Okay. Pursuing David Adderley across the Red and Arabian Seas. All the while, I wondered what Adderley could want in India. I assumed he had some other sort of refuge prepared. I referred to my attackers in Alexandria as thugs, but only colloquially now. At the time, I was fantasizing that Adderley served a real Kali cult. Perhaps he was trained in their dark arts. Leonora's pristine death might have been a tribute, a virgin to appease the demoness. Apologies to Kali, this is the character speaking. More likely, Adderley had some friend like Abdul Rashid in Bombay or thereabouts. He would attempt to lose me and go into hiding. Much of my time aboard the Merchanter was spent plotting how to avoid such deceptions. I would need allies again. I hoped the Crown's representatives would continue to aid me. Through them, I might enjoy the assistance of law enforcement. I needed to recruit localize as well, and before all that, I needed to refresh my wallet. Unexpected travel and its concomitant expenses were depleting my accounts. Justice demands investment, and honor can be costly. Adley could never repay the financial cost of his apprehension, but his capture and an explanation of his foul acts would be worth my expense. In addition to money, I was spending time. I'd already lost more than half a year to my obsession. If I had known how long this crusade would run, I might have turned back sooner. In Bombay, the police were slow to respond to my requests due to security arrangements for the upcoming visit by the Duke of Edinburgh. Eventually, I traced Adley to Watson's hotel. Arriving before me, he stayed in the city longer than I did, with our occupancies overlapping. Unfortunately, by the time I pieced together his movements, he was already on the train to Allahabad. Why there? Why continue deeper into Asia? I was still missing critical pieces of David Adley's story. Who was he? Why did he kill Leonora? Where was he running and why? Not that I failed to make inquiries. I wrote home throughout my travels to see what I could discover of the man there. I interviewed everyone who recalled Adley's actions. I heard nothing at first from back west. I learned more in India, but did not understand its importance. David Adley was certainly connected to the unholy and the occult. Among his visits in Bombay was to one of the darker and disreputable temples. I avoided that site, mindful of my previous injuries, but discreetly gathered information. The place was associated with multiple disappearances, mostly of unmissed low-caste menials. Adley was also gathering resources, both informational and physical. He visited 2 libraries, in one case slipping into an archival room without permission. He purchased chemicals, herbs, and small laboratory tools. He seemed to be assembling some sort of experimental apparatus with hints of alchemical purposes. At first, I had dismissed his activities as some sort of drug manufacturer. Perhaps he was seeking refuge from his crimes in intoxication, or he was funding his travels by selling illicit substances. I supposed he might even be concocting medicines legally and legitimately for himself. The thought that he might have some other more bizarre purpose never occurred to me, not for years. I never realized that David Adley's actions were directly linked to his past crimes. I should have read the volumes he had tried to steal. I should have deigned to speak with the priests he troubled, the scholars he consulted. Instead, I drew my own assumptions and only focused on how to catch Adley. I tried to anticipate his movements strategically rather than holistically. I thought of him as a campaigner, evading me from stronghold to stronghold, rather than someone searching after his own target. These errors led to my great folly in Allahabad. I disembarked there a year into my journey. I rested, collected the mail that had followed me across 2 continents, and sought Adley's trail once again. And I found nothing. At first, I thought I was only searching in the wrong places, pursuing the wrong sorts of leads. I again hired informants and conducted interviews. The police were polite but unhelpful, viewing my endeavor as some personal vendetta, not a criminal case. Oh, you asked why POCs loop so much. I'm reading about a white colonist who's assuming privilege left and right. Nothing, and again nothing. No one had seen Adley. No one had heard his name. No one had taken his money. Had Adley finally vanished, disappeared into some anonymous hole? Or had he never come to Allahabad? Perhaps he left the train early at some other stop. I retraced my steps. I extended my investigation backward along the rail line. I even returned to Bombay for a week to make certain my quarry had not doubled back. Then I searched forward, spiraling out to all stops possible from Allahabad. Months passed, still no result. My funds dwindled from the effort. I was forced to delay while I negotiated for further support. After a year in India, I received a demand from home. Return or be cut off. I protested my devotion to Leonora's memory and the need to preserve our family honor. The response was uncompromising. Honor was one matter. Wasteful delays and spending was another. My parents accused me of prodigality, spending the family fortune on loose living. They also noted my lack of progress. I had no good response to their legitimate complaints. I left Allahabad not willingly but for practical reasons. I consoled myself that I was not really abandoning my search, only pursuing it from afar. I returned home after 4 long months on a clipper around the Horn. My family received me as a prodigal son, my efforts lauded but clearly ruled a conclusive failure. I rejoined the family business as if my 2 years abroad were merely a long holiday. Though acquaintances occasionally inquired about my travels, my family strove to ignore the subject entirely. There was no talk of Leonora, or Adelie, or even of Senor Suarez, unless I initiated such. My parents soon quashed the topic, even when I did. At first, I resisted this erasure. I mourned Leonora, attempting sonnets to her memory. I sought more information about David Adelie. I even wrote to Senor Suarez twice more, without response. After a time, I too began to consider my quest a failure. I became embarrassed by my retreat and my sullied honor. As the months wore on into years with no further insights, my frustration transmuted into loathing and then apathy. The whole matter became the monumental regret of my youth, which would taint my middle years, and perhaps fuel tedious tales in my dotage. And then, unexpectedly, my inquiries bore fruit. 3 years after my return home, 5 years after Leonora's death, a professor at Cambridge, Dr. Harold Belding, finally answered my entreaties. His response was appropriately odd. At first, the scholar paid my letters no heed. My claims about former Professor Adelie's involvement with murder and his flight from justice seemed entirely too strange. But a year later, after hearing nothing more about or from his colleague, Dr. Belding had begun to wonder, and he had made his own inquiries. In the basement of a university office building, Dr. Belding found David Adelie's abandoned belongings. In the doctor's letter, he described a sample of the materials found therein. Ordinary chemical apparatus and textbooks of mundane complexity, but also occult volumes better suited to a thaumaturge. There were folios purportedly from the hand of Dr. John Dee, letters from American spiritualists, grimoires in impenetrable coded format, and anatomical sketchbooks apparently penned by madmen. Adelie's area of study was natural philosophy, not theology or history or classics, so he had no academic reason to compile such oddities. Instead, Dr. Belding concluded, as I did, that David Adelie was in the grip of some supernatural obsession. Dr. Belding endeavored over several months to decipher enough of these records to identify what Adelie had sought in his mad researches. When he obtained his answer, he finally contacted me. Dr. Belding concluded his letter with a final chilling paragraph. Adelie's interests extended through all the regions you've named. In Egypt, he sought knowledge of the soul's existence, independent of the body, and the means by which a magician could alter the soul's motions, particularly to interrupt its escape into the spiritual realm. In India, he queried yogis and swamis about meditation, astral experiences, and the cycles of rebirth, again seeking some means to obstruct the departed spirit. Dr. Adelie also read the ancient scriptures of Tibet and Nepal and researched the practices of Siberian shamans, though he had not yet troubled these practitioners directly. Throughout his notes runs an obsession with escaping mortality. Perhaps he sought an elixir of life to correct some chronic illness. Perhaps he merely feared his inevitable death. In any case, I am convinced that the death of your Leonora was a consequence of his practices. The manner of her passing suggests that David Adelie had learned something in his studies. Come to Cambridge if you wish to know more. I will make what I have available to you. Together we may find the answers you seek. Tibet or Nepal. I became certain Adelie had traveled north after dodging me in Allahabad. Dr. Belding's description also convinced me that Adelie had attempted some unholy experiment upon Leonora. Subsequently, he was seeking new information to correct his errors. Likely, Adelie had deceived Leonora into becoming his subject, snaring her by promises of eternal life or of sympathy for his decrepit condition. Either lure would appeal to her poetic heart. When business had slackened the following winter, I found an excuse to travel to Cambridge. I met with Dr. Belding and we perused Adderley's effects together. At first we made little progress, save to deduce the subject of Adderley's researches, some form of biological alchemy. We confirmed a connection to Leonora's strange death, but came no closer to finding Adderley. As my time ran short, I narrowed my focus to any document with a map or other geographic reference. Some of the volumes Adderley had collected were in languages neither I nor Dr. Belding could place. I hoped their origins would prove enlightening. One of these books, a handwritten journal crumbling at its edges, held the key. An academic acquaintance of Dr. Belding's identified the language for us as Old Tibetan, and essayed enough translation to identify the subject matter. I had to forcibly remove the volume from his possession after he discovered the book's revelations. The journal recounted a course of study with the lamas of a remote Tibetan monastery, including instruction in translating the soul out of the body and sending it abroad in the world. Tibet. That must have been Adderley's destination, his reason for passing through India. The journal's author described a valley beneath Mount Karakal, wherein was located the lamasery of Shangri-La. If not for the age and authentic language of the text, we might have considered the whole account a fantasy. Moreover, the writer included exacting, mundane details of his travels. Further points of coincidence reinforced my certainties. Adderley's notes remarked upon the transmigration of the soul. He wanted to replicate the techniques of the ancient lamas, though with alterations of his own, inspired by Western occultism. Adderley indicated frustration managing his early experiments, and a desire to speak to the original masters of this adopted art. We found suggestions that Adderley's decrepit physiology was a direct result of his failures. Perhaps he had reached a dead end upon himself and needed fresh flesh upon which to practice. Pardon my crude phrasing, but years of thinking upon these topics have altered my manners. I am fortunate I had no temptation to test the methods contained in Adderley's notes. Else my body and spirit might be as twisted as my language. I returned home and pretended to re-immerse myself in business, meanwhile gathering resources. I made allies among the transportation trades. I gathered new savings, representing this effort to my parents as the creation of a nest egg. I trained myself physically for hard conditions. I trained myself mentally by studying languages and occult concepts. In short, I prepared myself for another expedition to avenge Leonora. Would Adderley still be where I had lost him? Doubtful. Would he be ensconced in that strange Tibetan valley, Shangri-La? Unlikely after more than 3 years. But I might be able to pick up the threads of his passage again. I might find the path of David Adderley once more, and if not, I could satisfy myself that this final lead had been pursued to its exhaustion. I departed without farewells on November 24 of 1874, carrying as much of my fortune as I could withdraw. My family would never understand or approve my errand, and would cut off my resources once my absence was discovered. I planned a direct route to my destination the second time around. I took passage directly to Calcutta, still a grueling journey of 21 weeks. From there, I rode north on rented horses until I reached the Ganges, switching to a riverboat for a long ride into Nepal. I had learned from my first reckless pilgrimage. My second journey was better planned and executed. I traveled as a haggard itinerant rather than as a touring lord. I dressed more simply and kept my wealth hidden. I haggled for the costs of passage and food rather than accepting the first price. I spoke a little Hindi and picked up phrases in Bengali and Nepali to avoid standing out so sharply. I gave Leonora credit for shaping me into a more capable man in her death than I had been during our living acquaintance. In the mountains, I hired local guides, explaining myself away as a naturalist. I named David Adderley as a colleague, saying I had ventured on his recommendation to see the rare species of the region. The guides proved either trusting or uninterested, taking me to the Tibetan border without question. There I was traded off to Sherpa, who would escort me the remainder of the way. I told these guides nothing of Shangri-La, using only the peak of Karakal as my intended landmark. But perhaps the Sherpa guessed my intent. If so, they made no protest, nor did they mock me. Actually, very little conversation passed between us, save the minimum necessary. We traveled northward and upward as the spring of 1875 ended. I realized with some surprise that nearly 6 years had passed since I discovered Leonora Suarez dead in Valencia. 6 years I had pursued a murderer across the world, or rather the specter of a murderer. 6 years of obsession, waxing and waning. The travel had become its own end, rather than the means to accomplish revenge. As I trekked through valleys and clambered over rocks, I began to consider my efforts a quest for closure. I merely needed to know why. Why had Leonora died? How had it happened? If I learned that much, I might even pardon Adderley, particularly if he had also suffered and grieved. Finally, I stood in the shadow of Caracal. My guides would go no further, their agreed duty done. They urged me to collect my samples, take my notes, and prepare for return. I surprised them with my refusal. I bid them farewell, packing my own gear and preparing to descend into the valley beyond. Finally they left, shaking their heads at the white man's madness. I was bound to a long, hungry, hazardous journey back to civilization. Worse, if I tarried too long, I might encounter an early snowstorm before escaping the mountains. Was it worth the risk? I could not know for certain. I was gambling, wagering my life in return for a potential return to sanity. I was encouraged by the climate as I pressed on. My descent into the valley below Caracal was accompanied by steadily warmer temperatures and a surprising rise in humidity. I walked farther until I finally spied a complex hung on the side of the far hills, across the valley itself. I crossed through sparse forest and tended fields, watched curiously by the gowned residents of the monastery village. I walked to the monastery doors and knocked, waiting wearily on a stone patio just outside. After perhaps an hour, a young priest answered, demanding my purpose in common Tibetan. I understood just enough to ask if anyone could understand my English. He nodded and scrambled away, leaving me to wait again. It is a longer story than I thought. A few more pages. Hello and welcome to those coming in. Reading a story from a journal that I published long ago in 2016. It is a historical mystery tale called Transit. Resuming. I thought I had fallen asleep waiting. How else to explain the dreamlike appearance of my nemesis at that very door? Or rather, how to understand the nightmare turn of my long quest? Indeed, there was Dr. David Adderley. He was robed like any monk, but unmistakably the bowed and sunken monster underneath. He matched his descriptions perfectly. We stared at one another in mutual shock. I had no inkling my search would end right there. I had not given the acolyte my name, so Adderley had no warning whom to expect. I stammered eventually, "You, Adderley! David Adderley! I have found you! You have much to answer for!" Unbelievably, he smiled. Folding his hands and bowing, he answered, "Correct, and not correct. You have found David Adderley, but you have not. Come, and I will try to explain." So saying, he pulled the door open wide and gestured for me to enter. What was there to do? Refuse? Strike the man down when no resistance was offered? I was no longer furious with revenge, nor harboring a single drop of righteous justice. An explanation was precisely what I wanted, right after a warm bed and a hot meal. Adderley, or the man who so resembled him but claimed to be someone other, brought me to a sunlit sitting room with painted walls and woven rugs. He placed a tea kettle over a coal fire pit and readied 2 cups. I chose to sit across the room with my back to the entrance. Eventually, Adderley sat down himself. His eyes shone, but the smile from before was gone. He greeted me softly by name. Then he started to explain, an odd accent touching his English. "You followed me a long way, for a long time. I do not know whether I am happy or sad you succeeded. The answer may depend on your response to my words. May I first ask, why did you follow me? Why go to such trouble?" I gaped. My first answer was by rote. "Because you killed Leonora. Why else? Why would you not know that already?" Adderley winced at my vehemence, but replied calmly, "I see. But with apologies, I must ask, why pursue the murder of Leonora Suarez? Why not leave that to the rightful authorities? Why was it your duty? I became more thoughtful. Not only did I consider my own response more carefully, I began to wonder why Adley was bothering to interrogate me. Why not simply tell his tale, start to finish, and wait for my response? Why not take the opportunity to present his account first, attempting to gain my pity or understanding? I said, at first I sought revenge. I felt I had claim to Leonora. She had been stolen from me. I was outraged her life should be taken so callously, so young. The authorities were lax, and I was her only chance at justice. Adley looked nonplussed, but I was not done. I pressed on. Those passions faded eventually. What remained was my honor. I had pledged to Leonora's father that I would bring her murderer to justice, by whatever means necessary. I did not know at the time what means that pledge would require. At this, Adley grew somber, lowering his head. He intoned, "Do you still seek justice? Do you mean to fulfill your promise?" I sighed, drooping myself. I would like to say so, but it seems impractical at this point. If you intend to remain here, I will inform the necessary authorities of your whereabouts. But striking you down myself, I have not the strength now, nor the will to do so. I want only to know why. Why, Adley? What did you do, and why did you do it? Help me to understand. You owe me that. Then Adley stiffened. He looked me in the eyes with an intensity I had not seen from him since arriving. He spat, "I owe you nothing. You chose your path. I could not have stopped you, so I did not try. You chose based on ignorance and assumptions. You never could have understood what happened. I wonder if you will understand now. But here is your answer, and see what you make of it. I am not David Adley." Roused by his pique, I answered sharply back, "Do you claim to have shed your old life and found redemption here? Retreating from the world and taking vows does not excuse your crime. Or do you mean that your former identity was a lie? I should not be surprised. What I learned of your work at Cambridge suggested you were a fraud as a scholar." "No," answered Adley. "I mean that once this body did house David Adley, but it does no longer. It ceased to be his when he attempted to steal mine. Stupid man, I am Leonora." I was halted by this mad claim. Leonora? What did he mean? Had the shock of slaying my beloved unhinged Adley's mind, such that he had assumed the identity of his victim? But no. He mentioned stealing bodies, and that fit with Adley's research. More particularly, Adley had written of sending the soul out of the body. Could that mean it could enter another body? Still, I had to doubt. Suppose you are not merely lying to put me off. How could I know you are telling the truth? If we had once shared secrets, you could test my knowledge, but we were never that close. You presumed some romance that existed only in your mind. The rebuke stung, but I nodded. I was wise enough then to recognize it as truth. She continued, "I could attempt to demonstrate the technique, but I have not been here long enough even to gain an initiation. All I know are the rudiments of Adley's tutelage, the fragments he taught me in order to gain my trust." I interjected, "So you came here to learn more, to figure out what went wrong?" "Exactly so. I found myself trapped in the body of a dying elderly man. I suppose the relative youth and vigor of my spirit has kept this corpse together for a while longer. I also had his notes and his resources and no way to explain what happened, even to my father. So I fled, seeking answers. I retraced David Adley's route, but I found none who understood his actual discoveries, none who would believe what had happened to me. No one until I came here. The llamas saw who I truly was. All at once, they offered help. But their idea of help takes quite a long time." "The priest can verify your story?" I asked. "May I speak with them?" I will ask. She agreed. As difficult as it was to believe, I was already coming to think of this wizened creature before me as Leonora. I suspect that my acceptance stemmed from a desire to believe Leonora alive. If true, I had not failed in my quest. It was always based on false premises. We rose and walked together to the inner chambers where the lamas meditated, their spirits far afield. In time, an elder awoke and spoke to me. And he did, indeed, verify Leonora's identity and confirm her story. David Adderley had been a talented amateur, genius enough to catch the tattered ends of a greater power, but fool enough to unweave only a portion of that wisdom. Adderley grafted spiritual enlightenment onto the brute mechanisms of hermetic art and devised a means by which his soul could escape its vessel. He presumed this technique meant that he could force that soul into another, younger, healthier host. But his method was flawed. Another living person, a vessel already full, could resist his intrusion. And resist Leonora did. As Adderley forced her out of her body, she latched hold of his. The shock of the struggle must have overwhelmed David Adderley's vital energies, for when Leonora awoke, her own body was dead upon the floor without a mark upon it. She found herself in Adderley's withered husk, with no way to reverse the process. When the servants came knocking, she realized she would remain trapped forever, if caught. Or rather, she would remain prisoner until her soul was released upon David Adderley's execution for murder. Leonora fled, following the trail of Adderley's memories and notes eastward until she reached Shangri-La. She never meant that I should be hurt. Once she knew I was following, she tried only to evade me. The elder reiterated what they had told Leonora upon her arrival. Returning to her former body was impossible, even if it were not already buried and decaying. Their technique was never intended for such violent uses. In time, Leonora would learn to transcend her feeble body's limitations, until it would no longer matter what form she wore. When she was finally ready, she would transition to a new life, in a proper new body, as the cycle opened to her rebirth. I could tell Leonora was dissatisfied with this answer. She still hoped to regain a woman's body, if not something less aged. Perhaps this hope was what had slowed her progress toward enlightenment. When I noticed Leonora eyeing me hungrily behind Adderley's yellowed orbs, I realized that I could not linger to assist her work. I begged my leave of the elder, asking only for supplies enough to carry me to the next town. He agreed, but urged me to stay for the night. I left before Leonora awoke. Adderley's aged body still required considerable rest. I made my way out of the valley that afternoon and found a bier to sleep in that night. Over the following weeks, I worked my way out of Tibet and through Nepal, returning gradually into India. From there, I sent letters ahead to let my family know I still lived. I mentioned that my search was done, that Adderley was dead. I did not explain the particulars of his demise. I begged their forgiveness for my sudden departure and long absence, promising to make amends through renewed labor, free of any lingering regrets. I needed another 6 months to return home. My letters did not precede me by much. My reception was not so friendly as my first homecoming, but I had not been disowned. Among the conditions of my return to Grace was a complete and honest accounting of my actions. And so, I have prepared the account you read now. If it seems fantastical, that is no fault of mine. It is complete. It explains all. All that may be faulted is my composition, and perhaps my follies along the way. The particulars are accurate. David Adderley was dead before I set upon his trail. Leonora Suarez lives on. What happened to her after my departure from Tibet is no concern of mine. I have the remainder of a life to live. That is the story Transit, published in the first line back in, winter of 2016, one of my first published and paid stories. I may have lost the person who originally requested it. I don't know if you're still there, Rick. It did run long. It is 1:45 my time. So that took an hour to read. It doesn't look that long in the journal. I got to remember how long some things take. I'm going to hunt up another story I believe, like I say, I think it's called Honey, which is about a extra normal hound. Those of you who listened along may have noticed that that story went from a very staid historical mystery to something more occult. I blame the influence of a lot of H.P. Lovecraft reading and writing in that vein. But I will say that I'm proud that it's longer than that journal normally accepts, but they made an exception because they liked the story so much. And it all started with the very first line that they provided. In the 6 years I spent tracking David Adderley, it never occurred to me that he didn't exist. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. This was a live that was never announced. It was never supposed to happen. If you're still here, if you're viewing, you got to see something secret. It may not stay secret. I may yet publish it online and put it on my YouTube channel, but you were the first. And nobody heard that work before you on the story in the journal. So, good night. Enjoy the new moon, the darkness in which new things are hatched and old things put to rest. Appreciate secrets, things that are kept quiet, things that are held as a treasure. And sometimes that includes experiences you had with people now gone and can never be repeated. It includes your past history that you've never shared. Those are your treasures, and give them out sparingly. I'm Nathan Large. Go by Bardic Punk on TikTok. Have a good night. We always want others' secrets, but keep your own. Good night.